together in the 18th century was especially weak in the new urban areas. So in 1851, when they hold a religious census, they find out that only 41% of the population attended a place of worship on census Sunday, as it was known, and only half of those were a little. I'm just trying to do my math. A little under half of those were non-Anglicans. Okay, so Anglicans, a tiny percentage of people, people going to the Protestant Anglican Church, are incredibly small number in 1851, and even worse than that, most of the people who weren't worshipping were members of the new urban working class. Okay, the most dangerous people in terms of the view of authorities. So in London, for instance, only a fifth of people attended church. Okay? And so therefore the vast majority of the working class, of the new urban class, working class, the urban working class, were basically seen to be godless. I'll have more to say about that and about how different religious organizations try and fill that gap in a later lecture. But the point is here is seen that they're without a moral compass of authority. The second thing is that there is a relative absence of policing and of a police force. Okay, so you have this dramatically new society without effectively a police force. In the 18th century, a police force was thought to be very Prussian. That is to say that it reeked of a type of tyrannical state, imposing its authority upon the people. That was thought to be very un-British. You wouldn't know now, where everyone's got a security camera watching them, but at the time it was thought to be very un-British. Instead, policing came basically at a parish level, okay, by local constables, or watchmen they were often called. So the local parish, based around the Anglican Church, would hire a person, a guy, and he would be the person in charge of securing law and order. This was clearly hopelessly inadequate for the new social conditions of the first half of the 19th century. So in 1829, you get the creation of the Metropolitan Police Force. The Metropolitan Police Force, whose reputation is currently at an all-time high, because they've discovered not to be remotely corrupt, taking money from the Murdoch papers, or indeed at all racist in the aftermath of the riots of 2001. But this outstanding institution was first formed in 1829. And it was placed, and this is very important, directly under the authority of the Home Office, of the central government, and the Home Office, the equivalent of our Department of State. Now, even by 1841, okay, after it had been around for the best part of a decade, more than a decade, there was still only one policeman for every 900 inhabitants in London. Okay, so there's not a vast police presence on the streets. Okay, in 1835, a new act called the Municipal Corporations Act is passed, and this act allows other cities outside of London, other towns and cities, to create their own police forces, and indeed many do. So Birmingham, for instance, and Manchester, to give you two examples of big industrializing cities, Birmingham had one policeman per 610 residents in 1841, and Manchester had one policeman for every 840 inhabitants in that same year. Moreover, as you can see from the slide, many towns, which are known as boroughs, and many rural areas known as counties, still had no police force. So only 22 of the 171 boroughs still had no police force in 1848, and similarly, half of the, or 22 out of 53 of the counties in 1853. So again, my point is, Britain is ripe for a type of insurrection. It's also ripe for insurrection because the process of political and economic reform had been very dramatic. And I'm just going to do this very speedily because I'm going to talk about all of these things next week anyway. All you need to know now is that these two big political reforms in 1832 and in 1835 that changes the way people vote and who is qualified to vote. Okay? Very importantly, what 1832 and 1835 does is draw new lines about who can participate in representative political institutions. Okay? So clearly all of those who are left out of those acts are feeling particularly aggrieved. Okay? They're feeling like, well, how come we didn't get the vote too? Okay? Secondly, as you know, as I'm hoping you're getting by this point, there's had been a best part of half a century of measures creating the conditions of economic liberalisation. Okay, the reforms of banking, of tariffs and custom duties, etc., etc. Two key things that you need to know, though, was the creation of the new poor law in 1834, which provides a much, much more swingeing, hard-nosed approach to people in receipt of poor relief, okay, state-sponsored poor relief, much harder standards, much harder treatment of the poor. I'll talk about this next week. And the Factory Acts that had been introduced in 1833 had tried to provide a type of a regulatory framework for factories, but critically had failed to introduce a minimum 10-hour working day, which for many working people was the very minimum it was hoped to do. So basically, many members of the working class are very disappointed that they're both left out of this new political settlement, and the process of economic liberalisation has left them furtherly isolated and insecure. This creates a big reaction, basically, in two movements that combine radical working men, the working classes, and Tory paternalists, hoping to return to the old style system before the market had been liberalised. And these two movements were ingeniously known as the factory reform movement and the anti-poor law movement. I mean, why go any harder than just take the names of the acts that you're opposed to as a way of creating a name? Okay. Any questions about this stuff, which is basically just setting up the scene for what's going to happen in 1848 and 1857? Yeah. That's a great question. How did they get to choose who was a policeman? Effectively, what they wanted to do with police was to create a new type of professional unit, okay? But they therefore tried to create a cadre of sort of respectable working men, okay, who they could pay a wage that would keep them above the level where they might be susceptible from bribes. So it's a pretty unprofessional outfit, and the main story of the 19th century is that the salary levels and the career structures become more codified in order to try and isolate this group of people away from, effectively, the people that they have to police. Okay? Does that answer your question? Yeah. 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 They're appointed by a sheriff system. I love that idea that somehow this is the Wild West, you know, and you've got like a sheriff's badge, but it is effectively like that. So what would happen is that the watchman or the constable was appointed by the parish vestry, and every vestry, and this is so complicated, I'm not going to get into it, but every vestry basically had hugely different ways in which it was constituted. There were some that would be like all of us in this room would be able to vote. Okay, there'd be others in which only the property owners in this room, please raise your hand if you're a property owner. See, only the old guys were able to vote, and there were some where it was a mixture of the two, and the more property you had, the more votes that you got. So it was a hugely complex and slightly chaotic system. Okay, let's move on to Chartism. Okay, now the key point about Chartism is it comes out of the factory reform movement and the anti-poor law movement. Okay, and those are very important conduits. I love that word, conduits for the development of Chartism. And as you've all read, I'm sure, what was in the People's Charter. Let's just start at that point. Who remembers one of the points of the things? Now, I've forgotten your name, and I shouldn't. Charlotte? Yes! Get in. Yes, Charlotte. Right. So every electoral district would have the same number of people, so that every vote was worth the same amount. Okay? And again, at the moment, and I'll get into this next week, every electoral district in Britain had hugely different sizes. There were some where there were only 5 electors, and there were other where there was 500,000. Yeah. Your name? Sorry, I forgot. Catherine.
They wanted members of parliament to be paid, and I'm not sure entirely what they
Right. Okay, so there are 2 points there, Catherine's saying. One is that people elected to parliament had to be paid, because at that time there was no payment of MP, so therefore you could only do it if you had sufficient wealth to live off your often landed income, or sometimes your manufacturing income. And the other point that you said was the annual election, yeah? And the other thing was that elections had to happen annually, okay, so that the government was held to account every single year. So we've got 3 of the 6 points. Who's going to give me the 4th? Yeah. Yeah, Nikki. Universal suffrage? Universal male suffrage. So the vote for all men. So let's just count how many women in this room would not have had the vote if they were a supporter of the Chartist movement. Well, okay, you're not going to play my game, but you get the point. Another point. I think we're on number 5. Yeah.
They wanted to do away with property requirements for the parliament?
Right, absolutely. Again, no property requirement for a member of parliament. And then last one. Who's going to get the last one? Yes, your name. Jasmine. Secret ballot. The introduction of the secret ballot. Because it was thought that voting secretly was the only way in which working class people would be able to vote against the interests of their employees or landlords. Okay, 6 points of the Charter. Okay, very key point. Now, I think I have 2 stunningly important things to say about the 6 points of the Charter. One is that you'll notice that it's entirely a set of political demands. That is to say, their critique and their manifesto is entirely geared towards making the political system more democratic, at least for men. Okay, there's no economic program at all. No insistence, for instance, that there should be a 10-hour working day. Yeah? No insistence, for instance, that trade unions could legally organise, etc., etc. You can imagine the types of manifestos that they could have had, but it was in